super early morning, depending on where you are. To everybody, welcome to My Jewish Learning Daf Yomi Week in Review, somewhere in the middle of Tractate Sotah. I'm Rachel Scheinerman, and we are joined this morning by Dr. Sarah Ronas to steer us around the last week of Dapim.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see so many folks early for me, maybe midday or even late for you. Thank you all for coming. So we did a ton of really interesting detail work this week. We started out thinking about how the rabbis classify people whose learning or practice they think of as deficient, like the Tanaim. Then we moved into classifying people who erode the world. We thought a little bit, though we are going to come back to it, to the question of, does merit delay the punishment of the sotah? Then we had a really interesting discussion about the differences, the legal differences between men and women. Then we shifted to talking about whether women who don't drink, right, what kinds of women don't drink the bitter waters because their marriages were not considered legitimate to begin with, right? You have to have a legitimate marriage to be subject to the sotah ritual. We dropped back into the laws of Yibum, and I hope those of you who were with us for Yevamot felt like, oh, an old friend or an old person, maybe not a friend, maybe a nemesis, but an old familiar face. We talked about whether you can subject somebody to the sotah ritual before they're fully married. We asked whether a man can retract his warning, and spoiler alert, the long answer, there's a long discussion, but the answer is no. We asked about whether various women who are not your sort of, what the rabbis imagine as the normate, can be put through sotah, right? So an Ailonit, a sexually underdeveloped woman, the wives of converts, formerly enslaved people, and the wives of eunuchs. We asked about exactly what kinds of males a husband can warn his wife about, both human and otherwise, and what kinds of intimate acts would require one to undergo the sotah ritual. And then we thought about a series of teachings from Rabbi Akiva and whether or not the sotah ritual has effects on the woman's paramour. So really a lot of very different but interrelated ideas this week. And in the chat, as you're introducing yourself, I would love to hear what jumped out at you from that discussion. Now I'm going to take the presenter's prerogative, and I want to really think with you as I'm seeing what jumped out at you. I want to think with you about a really rich piece of the text from Sotah 22. Those of you who get the emails, I happen to know because I wrote Sotah 22 that I did not talk about this in the piece. So this is an additional piece if you're encountering this through the emails. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a link in the chat to the page. I'm also going to screen share, but I know that some folks really like to have it. And so here is the link to the PowerPoint. Chat, no, screen share screen. Here we go. All right. So this is from the discussion of people who erode the world. And we'll go through it and understand it. And then I want to talk about a couple of things that I find really remarkable about this and really worth us thinking about together. So, right, this is Sotah 22b. And those who are Prushin, and the word Prushin I am leaving untranslated for now, but as you were possibly reading this if you were reading this in the Steinsaltz, Davidson, Safaria version, I believe it was pseudo-righteous is how they translated it. I don't want to translate it that way yet. So those who are Prushin are people who erode the world. That's from the Mishnah. The sages taught there are 7 people who are Prushin. the righteous of Shem, the flagellating righteous, the bloodletting righteous, the pestle righteous, the righteous who say, what is my obligation and I will perform it, the righteous due to love, and the righteous due to fear. Okay, so we've got these 7 people who erode the world. Really interesting. And again, as a reminder for folks who are joining us, I'd love to hear where you're joining us from and what jumped out at you from this week's stuff. So we get this early tradition that explains who the 7 groups of people are who erode the world. Of course, I don't know about you, but I don't actually know what any of those mean. Luckily, I'm not alone. So if we keep going down, and you all can see it on my screen, right? Okay, great. So the righteous of Shem, this is one who performs the action of Shem. If you look at the medieval commentator Rashi suggests that the thing that they're referring to is being circumcising themselves in order to gain material things instead of for spiritual reasons. Those of you who know the story of Shem, which is in Genesis 34, is that right? Yeah, I think Genesis 34. No, Shem does a lot of bad things. So Rashi's suggestion, I think, is a certainly plausible one. The self-flagellating righteous. This is one who injures his feet. And here we're not necessarily just talking about self-harm. The medieval, again, Rashi says this is someone who sort of pretends to be more humble than they are and walks around in a sort of shuffling way, which ends up causing physical pain. The bloodletting righteous. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says this is one who lets blood against the walls. And again, going back to our old friend Rashi says that this is somebody who is so publicly invested in modesty that rather than see the licentious sights, they walk around with their eyes closed and then bang into walls. The pestle righteous, Rabba bar Shela says, one who walks bent over like a pestle. And a pestle, for those of you who aren't familiar with sort of kitchen tools, is the mortar and pestle where you grind things, and they're kind of like bent at the top. So here are the first 4 of the list. And I'm curious, what do you notice about these 4 categories? Let's take a break and get some insight. What do you notice about these? Either in the chat, or you could raise your hand, and Dr. Scheinerman, if you can see hands raised, and maybe cue some folks.
Sure. You're also a co-host here.
Yes, so but I can't see everyone.
Oh, you can't. Oh, because you're in screen share. No, we don't have. So Leah, I'm sorry, I never know how to pronounce your last name. Frey Rabin, maybe, says that overt righteousness. She sees overt righteousness performed for the effect, rather than for the sake of righteousness. Laura says, sorry, it's pulling up on me. Okay, not sure what you, Dr. Onis, meant about the people of Shechem doing bad things. The prince, yes, but the others, no. Okay, so that's this.
Absolutely.
And I think the story of Dinah here, so people have it at the front of their minds.
Yes.
Other answers to your question: people who overdo their religious observance, hypocrisy, people too righteous, people who hurt themselves but not others.
So right, that last one. And I'm seeing here, I just shifted everything around. I'm seeing Erica, right? That's a really interesting suggestion, because we would think that was a good thing, right? If you hurt yourself but not others, then presumably better than hurting others, but actually no. And then Rob, I see you say, right, visual representations that result from a need to externalize their self-perceived righteousness, right? That there's something about performance that's happening here. Asceticism on public show. What a great way to put it. Yes. And out of balance. I think all of you are spot on, right? There is something performative about this, and also out of balance, right? Out of balance, and perhaps not reflecting the real experience of what's going on inside. So, but then we get to the next three categories. The righteous one who says, what is my obligation? And I will perform it. And then the Talmud jumps in, whoa, 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 isn't that virtuous? Rather, the one who says, what further obligations upon me? And I will perform them. Right. So here, that addition of the word further in the English translation or to in the Aramaic suggests, right, imagine that kid who speeds through all their work really quickly in class and then makes a public show of saying, okay, I'm done. Can I get some more work? When everybody else is still halfway through, right? It's not just like, I've done everything. What's next? Can I get the extra credit work? Right. That's, I think, how we're supposed to imagine that one. Then we get to something I think is just fascinating. The righteous due to love and the righteous due to fear. Okay. So those are two of the 7 people in this earlier tradition that erode the world. Then we get Abaye and Rava, who are later than that earlier tradition. And they say to the Tana, and just as a reminder, does anyone remember what the Tana is in this case? I feel like it's like in school. Just as a reminder, the Tana is the memorizer, the one who memorizes the traditions and recites them back. Yes, Philip, A+. So Abaye and Rava said to the Tana, do not teach righteousness due to love and righteousness due to fear, right? When you are repeating this tradition, cross those out. As Rav Yehuda says, that Rav says, a person should always engage in Torah and in the mitzvot, even if not for their own sake, as through performing them not for their own sake, one comes to perform them for their own sake. So Abaye and Rava are later than the earlier tradition. Let's just do a little chronology. We got this early tradition. Then we have Abaye and Rava later. And between them, just to get this extra complicated, we have Rav Yehuda and Rav. So we have an early tradition. Then we have a tradition from Rav that says, no, doing things for not their own sake, right? Because you're scared of punishment or you want reward is actually a good thing because it trains you to then do it because you just want to do mitzvah. And then we have Abaye and Rava who say, okay, well, given that teaching, let's strike those 2 from the list. So so something about this just really grabbed me because I think that there is such an interesting shift we're seeing here, right? And I usually don't go into the sort of details of the history, but I think it's worth it here just to say, which of these are earlier and which of these are later, right? The later traditions that are critiquing that early tradition, they have the early tradition, but they're saying, no, that fundamentally just isn't correct. And we're going to strike it from the record, which is fascinating. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts or reactions to that move.
Of course, it isn't struck. It's right here.
Well, that's also true. That's also true. Any thoughts or reactions to this move?
Oh, we have a hand, Janine.
Wonderful. Janine, yes.
Well, I think they're saying, well, it's not great to do something out of love or fear, but it might not be so bad because it gets you in the habit of doing it, and then eventually you kind of realize it a little bit deeper. So I think they're also kind of maybe assuming the practicality of it, that it isn't good giving people a reason not to do something, not to do a good deed. It's not good to focus on that.
Yeah. So. Wonderful. Thank you, Janine. I think that's right. Anyone who's tried to build new routines knows, like, whatever gets you to start the routine, it can eventually become a real part of your life. Robert says how to stay relevant. Absolutely. Right. In a world where people are going to be doing things because they are scared of punishment or want reward. Let's recognize that and not tell them they erode the world. An ascent to a higher level. Yep. And I think this text may also be a piece of evidence for us about one of the things that the rabbis don't like about the Tanaim. One of the things that they see as a critique of the Tanaim. And I'm not convinced, right? If you read my piece on this, I clearly have a soft spot for the Tanaim, and I think there's lots of ways to study Torah. But the rabbis who have some strong negative feelings about the Tanaim, I think a story like this really highlights some of what bothers them, which is that if you're just memorizing and repeating, you're not thinking critically. You're not adapting to the needs of the day. Now, I think the Tanaim would say that's not what we're doing at all. We've got a whole other project. You can't judge us by a rubric that isn't ours. But I think we really see here how the rabbis see memorization as just not sufficient, and that actually being able to think critically and creatively can continue to make things relevant in a way that is important to the rabbis. Okay, let's keep reading. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said, "That which is hidden, and that which is revealed, but the great court will exact payment from those who wear the cloak." Which, I don't know about you, but sounds like something somebody in Lord of the Rings would have said to me. But essentially what that means is, you can keep things secret or public as you want, but even if you're covering yourself and your actions with a cloak of, righteousness or fake behavior, the great court up there is going to see what's actually happening. Right. So if some of these are about sort of public performance that doesn't align with who you are in person or inside, then the heavenly court knows that, is essentially what it's saying. Okay. So up until this point, we're seeing the word perushin really be used as something like those who separate. So often this gets translated as separatists, like people who want to stand out, people who break away from the norm. We also see this idea that there's something about sort of faking it in front of them. Right. So that's kind of interesting. But now we're about to get a completely different take on the Perushin. And I'm going to, you can't see it because I said it, but after the word different, right, we're going to see something very different. Imagine a question mark. Is it really different? So King Yanai, this is Alexander Jannaeus, the Hasmonean king, said to his wife, "Do not be afraid of the Perushin," and right, which here we're translating as Pharisees, "and neither from those who are not Pharisees. Rather, beware of the hypocrites who appear like Pharisees, as their actions are like the act of Zimri, who in Numbers 25 performs a very public act of desecration, and they request a reward like Pinchas, who becomes the high priest." Right, so they beware of hypocrites. And now, all of a sudden, the word Perushin, right, putting this story next to the previous discussion, really highlights, whoa, what is that? What is somebody who is a Perush? Is it a separatist in their behavior? Or is it someone who belongs to a particular sect of Judaism? Any thoughts about this connection that the Talmud is making? Robert.
So my question is, sometimes when the Talmud says, group A, it really means not group A. Oops, I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yeah, of course.
So is this about the Pharisees or the Sadducees or what? I'm going a little bit tangential to your question just to understand
Absolutely, right. Understanding is the key. So thank you for giving us the opportunity to make sure we're all on the same page. So King Yanai, who is the historical king, Hasmonean king Alexander Jannaeus, in the work of the Jewish historian Josephus from the 1st century, he describes Alexander Jannaeus as really, really hostile to the group called the Pharisees, the sect called the Pharisees, like murdering a lot of them. His wife, who then becomes the sole ruler after him, Queen Salome Alexandra, she reintegrates the Pharisees into the government, and according to Josephus, really ushers in a period of peace and harmony and coexistence within the Jewish sects. So this story here, where King Yanai is saying, don't be afraid of the Pharisees, is actually paralleled by a Josephus story where Alexander Jannaeus, as he's dying and his wife is about to take over, gives her instructions on how to not make the mistakes he made. So here I would say this is really talking about the Pharisees. Yeah. And neither from those who are not like the Pharisees. I think we could imagine that as the other sects or the people who don't belong to a sect at all. Does that help, Robert?
May have gotten muted again.
Totally fair.
There you go.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Leah, I see your hand.
This whole Pharisee controversy has given rise to a lot of misconception of who this school actually was. The Pharisees, I know with my Christian friends, it's used in a derogatory way. And I don't know if this is based on earlier misconceptions and the enmity that Yanai had and then regretted. I don't know, because I'm not sure exactly when this misconception and this negativism regarding the Pharisees originated. I would assume that it did sometime after the 1st century, although we don't know when the Gospels were really written. Definitely they weren't eyewitness reports. So could this be one of the things, the story in Josephus, one of the things that helped perpetrate this false representation?
Wonderful question. So for those who are less familiar with the Christian New Testament, the Pharisees get used in the New Testament as a major critique of hypocrisy and false teaching. And what Leah is pointing out, I think so astutely, is that that is a description which at the time the authors of the New Testament texts, many of them were themselves Jewish, and they were sort of critiquing, like the worst thing you say about your sibling, right? Like it's an inner religious debate. And what ends up happening is it gets used in a lot of really anti-Semitic ways, right? The idea that Pharisees are hypocrites is a real contributor to a lot of this, to a lot of that anti-Semitism. I am actually going to, in the interest of continued learning, I'm going to put in the chat a piece that Dr. Amy Jill Levine wrote about this. Yes, I see the book. It's a wonderful book. If you want the not the book, but the short article version of that, this article by Dr. Amy Jill Levine
Yeah.
explains
Yeah.
some of what Leah was pointing to. Absolutely. But I think what we see here is that, and actually, if you read the Gospels more carefully, this is true in some of them as well. The problem isn't Pharisees. The problem is hypocrites. Right. The problem is hypocrites. And so I think we see that here as well. Right. The idea that Pharisees might be fine, and those who aren't Pharisees might be fine. But people who sort of fake holiness, which is, found across traditions, those might be the problem. And I'm seeing some beautiful explanations in the chat about wholeness and, the ways that some of these things are, harmful to the individual and also the community. I think we have time for one more comment. So Carol, I see your hand.
Dr. Ronas, I have a question. Kind of goes back to what Dr. Scheinerman said toward the beginning. In your mind, why is this debate, this conflict captured in Talmud, particularly here? Was it to say something more about the method of Talmudic study or about the content of Sota? Why is it here? Like, what's the bigger message, the bottom line, if you understand what I mean? And I'm sorry I don't have a better grasp on it.
No, I think part of what we're seeing in this whole section is the rabbis trying to categorize people and also trying to understand what kinds of behaviors are harmful to the community. And so as part of those conversations, we shift to talking about all of those whose behaviors the rabbis think of as harmful to the community. And I think what we're seeing in this particular piece, and this is part of the larger conversation, I just pulled a piece of this out for us today. I think part of what we're seeing is that it's complicated and that it's not a question of just the more pious you are, the better. That there is a point at which the public performance of religiosity becomes dangerous. Erode the world, right? Whatever that means literally, I don't know. But I think it's fair to say it's not a good thing, right? I feel confident saying those who erode the world are seen as doing something wrong. And I think we're seeing that here in a really interesting way. And I think we're seeing some of that with this great slippage between Perushim as separatists, as particular group, as possibly people who separate from the community or from sin, right? You could say I'm a separatist from sin, but I'm also maybe a separatist from the community. And maybe I'm part of a group and maybe I'm not. And I think there's something really messy there. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting, and this text gets used a lot when the scholars try to understand the origins of the rabbis, right? Because the rabbis sort of become prominent on the scene after the destruction of the temple. And so many scholars try to understand, well, then what earlier Jewish sect are they emerging from? And I think texts like this complicate that picture for us. People sort of often you'll read, well, the Pharisees became the rabbis. And I think there are lots of overlaps. But I think part of what we're seeing in this text is it's not that simple, right? There's continually, right? Don't be afraid of the Pharisees, but also those who are not Pharisees, right? None of these groups are necessarily harmful. Maybe they're all a piece of who we ended up. But the problem is that hypocrisy, that public performance, which causes harm to the self and the community. And I think we can certainly draw connections between public performance and the Sota ritual in all kinds of ways. But in the interest of time, I want to say I think that's sort of where we can stop with this. We could talk about this text for hours. But I know everybody wants to start their day or go to bed, depending on where you are. So I wish you a wonderful, wonderful week and happy learning.
Some of it's morning and we want to go to bed, but I have to say, I'm thinking about is there much that I do that isn't motivated by love or fear? And I'm not sure that there is. Personally, that's my takeaways from this. So thank you, Sarah, for bringing us such a rich set of texts and also such a great summary at the beginning of all the very interesting things we covered in this whirlwind week in the Daf. Thank you, all of you, for your intelligent and interesting commentary and questions. It's always a pleasure to get together with you. And we will see you in your inbox tomorrow morning and in this space in 1 week time. Everybody be well.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.